So thanks very much, and everyone who's joined today. Welcome to this session, which is really about switching over from your agent or ultimately taking over the lease and management of your own property. My name's Jeremy Goldschmidt. I'm the founder and CEO of Rent Better. We have a whole range of tools and services and a whole platform dedicated to self-managing your property. So we do deal with a lot of landlords who are either looking to switch over from an agent to managing themselves, or who simply have, long ago decided to do that. So we do field a lot of questions on this topic, and that's part of the reason why we decided to schedule the session today on that. Thank you all for being here and for joining. If you've got any questions as we go through it, by all means, feel free to just jump in and you can either put it in the chat or in the Q&A section. I'm very happy to sort of take questions as we go. I'll keep talking and run through my list of items to cover, but I'm really, really happy to cover topics that are of interest to participants. So without any further delay, I guess when we say switching from your agent, what do we really mean? Again, the goal is to sort of take over your lease, and you would have previously had an arrangement with a third party or a property manager or an agency. It may be the person who actually sold you the property in the first instance, or someone who you've just, maybe your family and friends always deal with, and they're currently managing the property on your behalf. Now, the first step in any sort of, breakup or any sort of switching process is to understand the agreement that you have in place. And typically you'll have a management agreement, and somewhere in there'll be a clause called the termination clause, and there'll be some sort of notice period. Very, very commonly we see something like a 28-day or a 30-day notice period. And so that automatically means that if you're going to sort of break or terminate the agreement or break the arrangement that you've got, you would give 28 days or 30 days notice. It does two things. Number one, it gives obviously a courtesy to the agency to say, hey, there's going to be a change coming up. And, from their perspective, they can sort of adjust how they operate. And I guess it also does a bit of a courtesy for your tenants so that they know a change is coming too. So you'd want to look through that management agreement and just find the exact date and time. Sometimes we see both ends of the spectrum, where some agents are sort of wise enough and sensible enough to know that if in the future, you might want to sell or buy a property, there's a good chance that you're in that local community too, and you'll know them. And so there's not really much point in sort of making it a difficult handover or slowing the process. And they'll get right on it. And even, in some instances, they may say, don't worry about the waiting period, here you go. There are other instances where we see more difficult contracts or more difficult arrangements. Sometimes there's a 90-day termination period. Sometimes we've seen people who get really sort of, bitey is probably the right way of putting it. And as soon as somebody sort of puts up a bit of a suggestion that they're going to terminate the agreement, the walls come down and it becomes very hard to get information, and it's slowed down, and anything they can do to keep you on the books for longer. It's not that common, but it does happen. And look, we just think as a professional courtesy, if someone's told you that they're going to break an agreement, the right thing to do is to sort of recognize that, there's not much in it. They've made a decision, and it's sort of time to part ways on good terms. So the first step is actually doing that. Once you know the time frame, you would send either a formal letter, you can send an email. You might like to, as a courtesy, just put in a call as well. And we actually have a kit on the landing page of the Rent Better website, which shows you the sort of steps involved and gives you a template. But it would just be something as simple as including, obviously, your name and your details, your property address so that they know which property it is, and obviously addressed to either the property manager or the principal to say, basically, I plan to terminate, and on this date we will cease our arrangement. Please provide, and this is probably the crux of what we'll talk about today, sort of these 6 key artifacts, which we believe are a big part of the handover. And then from the perspective of the landlord, really the next step is making sure that those artifacts and the property come back in an acceptable condition and time frame. And that's kind of what you're managing from the moment you issue that termination letter till the time where you get your keys back. You're kind of making sure that information is as you expect it. And the things to ask for, some of them are really basic and obvious, but some of them can sometimes be tricky. So we usually suggest asking for them a bit earlier so you can see what you're going to get, and you've got an opportunity to sort of adjust if necessary. So at the point that you've agreed that the termination is going to happen on a certain date, and for argument's sake, let's just say it's 30 days from today, the first thing you'd want to be doing, and hopefully you've already got this, but if you don't, asking for a copy of the current lease agreement. The second thing to ask for is a copy of the current condition report, right? So what was the last version that was produced? And sometimes, there's an entry and there might be a quarterly or a half yearly version of that. So you want all the condition reports so you've got a benchmark and you can see over time what the changes are. You obviously want a copy of the keys and to know what an inventory of the keys looks like. You may not, in fact, take possession of those keys until the last day, but you're just going to want to include that as the list of things that you want. And look, sometimes, without any malicious intent, things get lost, and you may have left them with multiple sets of keys and maybe now only one of them exists, but you just want to be checking. That sort of stuff ends up being expensive, and you're going to just put through your request that says, I'd like the keys on this date, and confirming ahead of time that I will in fact get those keys. Now, so that's the first three. As I said, the agreement, the condition report, and the keys are all pretty basic and obvious, and they're documents that could be produced pretty quickly. The next three is where it's not that it's tricky, it's just that there's a bit of work involved, obviously. And that's where we often hear from our customers who are either switching or from people who are in the process of switching or those who have switched, that it can get a bit tricky. So the three to talk through are the tenant ledger, a sort of report that covers all maintenance and expenses, and the actual transfer of the bond from the agency over to the landlord. The first one is the tenant ledger. Now, it shouldn't be too much of a surprise for the landlord to know the position financially of the property. And so that is, whether the property or the tenant is in arrears, whether they're ahead, what's the amount. Again, in most cases, we'd expect, certainly if there's a big arrears, that the landlord would be clear. Sometimes the tenant may just be, a little bit ahead, or there's small amounts in it. But what ends up being tricky, and we do see this all the time, that, and again, no fault of anyone's or any particular agent or agency, but typically there's a disconnect between the particular property manager or the agent that you're dealing with and the person in the back office who's largely doing finance, which means that anything from when payments come through to accounting for them to making sure that the ledger's up to date, or even your end of year statements and reports, you may sometimes find that there's a discrepancy and it's hard for someone to explain it. And again, the person that you deal with ends up being the sort of customer-facing property manager who's on the ground versus the person who's dealing with the numbers in the back office. And so when it comes to a tenant ledger and a full record, and again, sometimes it might be many, many years. Sometimes it may only be a short time. Sometimes the tenant, started paying weekly and then they switched to monthly and then they switched back, or they asked for a discount, or they started paying more. That ledger really has a great risk of getting messy pretty quickly. And, there are some big systems out there where people can obviously, or agents obviously, use property management systems to produce these reports. But we see time and time again, people either getting a report that doesn't make sense or it's a bit confusing to them. And so this is the one where we recommend just spending a bit of time. If your tenant's up to date and the records show they're up to date and it all makes sense and looks clean, great. There's no reason to sort of, you're not trying to scrutinize and audit the books. But if it all makes sense, it all makes sense. If things start to suddenly look a little bit out of whack, or there's this thing in there that just, looks like a missed payment, we recommend just looking a little bit further, because at the end of this 30-day period, when you do the handover, as nice as, the property manager may be or the agency may be, you're not going to be their customer anymore, and the sort of willingness and ability and even the time for them to come and help you go through it is much lower. So we always recommend just do an extra once over of that ledger and make sure it makes sense to you. The second area is going to be on maintenance and reports and expense reports. And again, from that perspective, it's as much about knowing what's been spent and what's happened as it is you're sort of going to carry this into the future. And, I know that with my properties that, I have my personal properties, you are across it because you feel the pain of the expense, or when something's happened, or whether the electrician and the plumber and the this and the that. And certainly if it's major capital works, it's memorable. But I don't know, small things like whether you're changing the hot water system and on what date it happened, it could sometimes be a little bit less familiar to you if you didn't do it. And therefore having a record of when that happened becomes important. And again, we think this is the last time that you're going to get real attention from the property manager or the agent, and it's worth more than just a quick once over. we think it's worth just taking a look, making sure you've got dates and amounts and that it's clear to you at tax time what you're going to have, so that you're not fumbling around and asking later. This, in a sense, should be a clean break for you. So that's sort of number 5. And then number 6, in terms of artifacts, and again, this really is not a tricky one, but we see a lot of questions about this coming through. When you're switching over from the agency, how do you do the transfer of bond? Now, in most states around the country, except for one territory, actually, most states around the country have a rental bonds online platform, which is typically run through the sort of local state-based regulator or authority for properties. And what will typically happen is your agent would have an electronic or an online account with them, which is where they would have registered your bond. And so, your name may be Jeremy and you're the landlord for the property, but the agent, in fact, has registered the bond under their account. Yes, it's for the property address that you own, but it's between them and the tenant through the regulator or through the bond authority. The transfer of bond, and in most cases now it's an electronic process as opposed to a signed form, but there are still some paper-based methods that can be used and some signed forms. But actually the process that they have to go through, and this is why I think it's no longer such a tricky thing, is they're going to say, well, the bond was held in name of agency, and now the bond is the same amount of money, but it's going to be held in the name of landlord. So the agent, in fact, is just going into their system and their sort of access point to the bond authority, and they're just switching over where that bond belongs to. So from a, if you like, an administration and a process perspective, it's actually been made a lot simpler the last couple of years, and most states have pretty decent systems to do this. So whilst I think it's a really sort of big area for questions and for people feeling less comfortable or less confident with how it works, just note, or I guess take comfort, that it's basically just switching over an account, and it's not as big a deal as you might believe. So on the basis that you've issued a termination notice to tell your agent or property manager when you're taking over, you've asked for these 6 things. We do think it's sensible that in a couple of weeks earlier or as soon as possible, you say, could I see an early version of these things and what's going to happen? And that should give you 2 things. Number 1, it should let you know sort of how clean what you're going to get as handover is going to be. And if it's all in sort of, a pretty neat bundle and tied up, then you can feel more confident. If you start, oh, we're not going to give you this, we're not going to give you that, or it might be hard, it sort of senses early that there could be a bit of a challenge. And it's more at this point, just making sure that things that you expect to happen at the end will happen. And the one, again, assuming all these things happen, what you want to be able to do in that 30-day period is reach out to your tenants and communicate to them that on this particular date, we are taking over, and on this particular date is when that payment after that date is. And so therefore you'll make it to us or to the landlord. You will not be making it to that agency anymore. And so, look, it's a little bit easier when you use the Rent Better platform, because you'll send them an invitation which will explain some of these processes, and it's pretty simple for them to get set up. But the trick of the dates and the timing, again, is sometimes, and again, no one's trying to do anything malicious, but sometimes you will find that people are just used to making payments a certain way, and they'll just keep doing it. And so what you really want to do is avoid this post breakup with the agent, that your tenant has in fact paid the agent again, and you have this annoying process of having to chase the agent to sort of catch up on your fees and get them to pay it back to you. And it's not like they're going to withhold it. It's more just an extra bit of admin burden. So we would typically, if you're on a monthly schedule or a fortnightly, we would typically suggest that you pick the 30-day end date or the termination date just before the final pay, or just before a payment period, so that you've got, or just after that last payment period, so that you've got enough time to get your tenant set up in the new way and that there's no questions. So it could be, if the payment's due on a certain monthly date, well, you might want to, at the end of the last month, issue the termination notice, so you've got exactly the right amount of time for the next payment to come to you, and you would communicate to your tenants. So how does that communication with tenants work? Well, oftentimes you'll have their details, and it's simply about introducing yourself and letting them know that, hey, I'm going to take over and we'll be doing X, Y, and Z. Again, if you're going to use the Rent Better platform, it's a lot simpler to just send them the invitation, and at the same time you could make a call and just introduce yourself, but the system will help them get set up. And really, I guess like anything in life, you're meeting someone who you may not be that familiar with, but you're going to manage a relationship with them. So you want to start on the right footing of just, I guess, courtesy and letting them know that you'll be taking over, what's going to change. I personally like to ask whether there's anything that, they think has not been handled or addressed that they'd like. Gives you a chance to understand whether there are any hidden issues you hadn't known about. And just gives you a chance to sort of, I guess, engage with someone and talk about something specific. So from a communication point of view, again, it's about introducing yourself and setting those dates for when really the main thing, which is the payments at the beginning, is going to change. Once that's happened, it does tend to be a bit more smooth sailing from there, because then everything gets into a bit of a routine and a process. And of course, yes, there's some tenants who may have more questions at the beginning because any change is difficult for people. But typically you're just in and around that process, making sure that they feel comfortable and you're comfortable. And I think like any human interaction, there's an element of communication and there's an element of chemistry. And so we think if you sort of put your best foot forward at that first introduction and just say, this is what's going to happen on these dates. If you've got any problem, let me know. That does make a big difference, because now the tenants know who to go to and who's making decisions. I'm just going to pause there. I haven't had any questions come through, which is either a result of a very direct and straightforward presentation or people being shy. So I'm just going to open up here, because we'll move to sort of closing out and a quick summary. But if you do have any questions, I'm more than happy to cover them here. But I guess moving towards the summary of all of this is, what is the goal? The goal is to take back the lease and take over the management of your property. And that involves, one, a termination with your current agent. So you would look through the management agreement, find the dates and timeframes, issue a notice to the agent and let them know. Part of that, you'll let them know that these 6 artifacts are the things that you'd like, and that would include an agreement, a condition report, the keys, a tenant ledger, maintenance and expense reports, and a transfer of the bond. Those 6 things, again, you can manage over the time from issuing the notice till the actual final date. You're going to introduce yourself to the tenants and let them know that the exact date that the payment method will change and how that's going to change. And finally, if you're getting set up on the Rent Better platform, you'd basically go to the website, click Get Started. You can enter your property and set up the details, and then either choose to create a lease agreement with your tenant, which you can send to them, or just set them up directly and send out an invitation. So those are really the major steps. Okay, just one here. Look, is there anything else with the lease agreement that you'd need? Often with a lease agreement, it should come in a package, but the tenant may have submitted an initial application, or there might even be a tenant check. So that would hopefully be part of the package that you'd get with your lease agreement. But typically that's what you're getting. And because the lease agreement is, even if it's got an end date that sort of is, if you like, after the fact of handing over the management, as the landlord, you're already on the lease agreement and there's sort of no change. It's not like you need to create a new lease agreement. If you wanted to, of course you can. But that handover is literally a document that's often in flight and in existence. And so you should feel comfortable just sort of picking it up and running with it. All right. Well, if there's no further questions, I'll just move to a close here. I guess if you do have questions that you don't want to bring up, you're always welcome to email us at info@rentbetter.com.au. Thanks very much for your time. Really appreciate you joining us today and hope that was a helpful session. Thanks again.